Welcome to PPR Global. The war started in Crimea and will end there. At the time when these words came out of the mouth of Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy, Russia had blockaded a large part of the country, including the Ukrainian coastline, continuously from Crimea with very heavy pressure. Every day, missiles, drones, and gliding bombs of the Russian army were launched from Crimea into Ukraine. Time passed, and the circumstances of the war changed. The Ukrainians have created an astonishing breakthrough on the Crimean Peninsula, the Pearl of the Black Sea. Now, Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin has a big problem on the peninsula. Putin is in danger of losing control of Crimea. Attacks and explosions, especially on the Crimean coast, have seriously alarmed Russians on the peninsula. The Russian army and the Russian people are in a state of panic. The source of the panic was clear: the fear of losing Crimea. So what will happen if Russia loses the peninsula, and how will the power rivalry in the Black Sea be shaped? Will the loss of Crimea make Putin lose the war in Ukraine? Before going to Crimea, the strategic peninsula of the Black Sea, where all these scenarios are shaped, please do not forget to subscribe to our channel, turn on notifications, and like to be informed about our content. Let's better understand what the peninsula means for the most critical war of the century, where Putin is likely to be humiliated against Ukraine, and what the consequences of Crimea's loss would be for Russia. In Crimea, the Kerch Bridge and the military formations around it have been targeted many times. In fact, the increased attacks by Ukrainian forces and attempts to erode the Russian presence in Crimea seem to have been successful. In particular, the complete destruction of the oil depots in the port of Feodesia increased the desperation of the Russians. As a result of the attack, the vehicles of the Russian army in Crimea were left completely without fuel. There are now serious efforts to meet the oil needs of Russian military vehicles. This leaves the approximately 60,000 Russian soldiers in Crimea largely helpless and defenseless. Attempts to wear down the Russian army in Crimea, which have been underway for nearly 3 years, seem to be beginning to bear fruit. Thousands of Russians have been evacuated from Feodesia in recent weeks. The Ukrainians are signaling that they will take back Crimea with such attacks. Realizing this danger, the Russians in Crimea are leaving the peninsula. It is estimated that the number of Russians who have fled Crimea so far has exceeded 100,000. Last summer, the Crimean coast was empty. Some Russians sold their houses and land and left the peninsula. Even high-ranking soldiers of the Russian army sent their families to Russia. But this is just the beginning. There is a great panic in the Russian army and in the Kremlin. However, it is not a big problem for Putin that the Russian people periodically leave the peninsula, and the Russian army is in a difficult situation in Crimea. The real problem was that the Russian Navy had to flee Crimea, and Russia lost control over the Black Sea and the Ukrainian coast. The Russian military has made many defensive attempts to prevent this, but so far they have not succeeded. On the other hand, the ever-increasing offensive range of Ukrainian forces and the expansion of its navy is another source of panic in the Kremlin. Likewise, the Black Sea is very important for Russia. Losing control of Crimea would also mean losing control of the Black Sea to a large extent. Control of the Black Sea's near waters has been a bone of contention for centuries and has played a role in the current Russian-Ukrainian war. Crimea has been one of Russia's lifelines. Russia's seizure of the Crimean Peninsula in 2014 gave it control of the seaport of Sevastopol. What is close to Ukrainian waters has become de facto near waters for Russia. Controlling these near waters allowed Russia to disrupt Ukraine's trade, especially grain exports to distant African waters. However, Russia's move was thwarted by the cooperation of Romania, Bulgaria, and Turkey, which allowed cargo ships to pass through their near waters and then through the straits to the Mediterranean. Ukraine's use of these other countries' near waters allowed it to export between 5.2 million and 5.8 million tons of grain per month in the first quarter of 2024. This was, of course, a drop from Ukraine's exports of around 6.5 million tons per month before the war, then falling to just 2 million tons in the summer of 2023 due to Russian attacks and threats. But Russia's efforts to limit Ukraine's control of its near waters in the Black Sea, and NATO countries' unwillingness to face the consequences of attacking ships in its near waters, meant that Ukraine still had access to distant waters to make economic gains and keep its economy afloat. In addition to being hampered in its ability to disrupt Ukrainian exports, Russia has also been subjected to direct naval incursions into Crimea. Since February 2022, using unmanned attack drones, Ukraine has successfully sunk or damaged Russian ships and weakened Russia's Black Sea Fleet. When the full-scale invasion began, the Russian Black Sea Fleet had 74 warships, most of which were stationed in ports in Russian-occupied Crimea. It sank about 28 of its pre-war fleet of about 36 warships and damaged others. Russia was forced to limit its use of Sevastopol and deploy its ships in the eastern part of the Black Sea. Russia's Black Sea Fleet was unable to operate effectively in the nearby waters it had gained with the capture of Crimea. Russia's naval defeats against Ukraine marked the collapse of its historical difficulties in projecting naval power and the consequent tendency to focus mainly on the defense of the near waters. In other words, in the struggle for control of the Black Sea, Russia faced a surprising defeat. This loss has potentially far-reaching consequences. For Russia, this tragic situation has limited its ability to project power around the world through naval means. In fact, the curtailment of the Russian Navy was so shocking that Putin's last remaining patrol ship in Crimea was observed sailing from Sevastopol to Novorossiysk. Against all odds, the withdrawal of Russian warships from Crimea could be a sign that Ukraine is actually winning the war at sea. When Russia first blockaded Ukrainian ports on the eve of a full-scale invasion in February 2022, few believed that the dilapidated Ukrainian Navy could seriously challenge the dominance of the powerful Russian Black Sea Fleet. But once hostilities began, it quickly became clear that Ukraine had no intention of giving Putin control of the Black Sea without a fight. Ukraine used a combination of domestically produced drones and missiles, along with long-range weapons supplied by the West, to deliver a series of devastating blows against Putin's fleet. Cruise missiles delivered by Kiev's British and French partners played an important role in this campaign, but the most effective weapons of all were Ukraine's rapidly developing fleet of innovative naval drones. In total, Russia has attacked nearly 200 port facilities since withdrawing from the grain deal in July. But Ukraine's drone army has tempered Russia's aggressive behavior in the Black Sea. Ukraine had to work hard to create its own corridor, overthrowing Russia's dominance in the Black Sea without a single working warship. The first success came shortly after the Russian invasion, when Ukraine blocked an amphibious landing. It was a close-range thing, but the key moment was stopping Russia's westward encirclement of Odessa at Voznesensk, 100 kilometers away, in March 2022. 2 months later, Ukraine was able to impose a 100 nautical mile buffer in the northwestern part of the Black Sea after destroying Russia's Moskva flagship and regaining control of the strategic Snake Island. The third phase, completed in 2023, saw Ukraine completely push Russian warships out of the northwestern, central, and even southwestern parts of the Black Sea. This final piece of the puzzle relied on Ukraine's naval forces developing an arsenal of missiles and drones to hunt down and sink Russian warships. Ukraine's new deterrence capability, created by all this, allowed Russia to bet that it would not attack a foreign merchant ship. Not only would such an attack provoke an international backlash, but the threat of escalation means that it would increase insurance premiums in the Black Sea, including for maritime transportation to Russia. So far, Ukraine has won the bet, with the exception of a Liberian-flagged ship that was probably hit by accident while anchored in Pivdeni last November. Russia can and does drop gliding bombs from the air in the general direction of the emergency corridor. Mines from the Second World War are also an occasional problem. Both are a nuisance, but not enough to deter large cargo ships. Despite such threats, Ukraine's efforts to become more active in the Black Sea have been a boon to Kiev in the war. The launch of Odessa's deep-sea ports, for example, is a timely boost to Ukraine's battered economy. Ukraine's Deputy Economy Minister Oleksiy Sobolev told the press that the lifting of the sea blockade is estimated to add at least $3.3 billion to exports this year and 1.2 percentage points to GDP growth. Still, those involved are too cautious to declare victory. One trader in charge of one of Odessa's largest private terminals requested anonymity for fear that Russia would target his business. It is known that Ukraine does not yet have sufficient air defenses, international monitoring, and ideally international military escorts to make the new corridor fully secure. But even in the worst of times, the Ukrainians have proven one successful point. And that is the fact that maritime transportation will continue even during Russian bombardment. While the Ukrainian side took steps to increase its strength in Crimea, Russia started to send additional military resources from Crimea to stop the Ukrainian military action in the Kursk Oblast. This was quite surprising. The Atesh group, known as the Ukrainian Partisan Movement, reported that Russian troops were transporting weapons, ammunition, and military equipment from the occupied Crimean Peninsula to the Kursk region and published very important photos on the subject. In the description of the published photos, the Atesh group claimed that weapons, ammunition, and military equipment belonging to the 810th Marine Brigade of the Russian Army were being prepared for departure to the Kursk Oblast. The 810th Separate Marine Infantry Brigade, part of Russia's Black Sea Fleet coastal forces, is based in Kozacha Bay near Sevastopol. The transfer of this brigade's weapons and other military equipment to Kursk leaves Kozacha Bay vulnerable. Or were the Russians agreeing to give this area to Ukraine as a gift? According to the partisans, Russian forces continue to repair damaged equipment at repair centers at the base of the 810th Brigade in Crimea, and then send it for deployment to the Kursk region, without regard for the security of Kozacha. The Russian military is also trying to fill this shortage of weapons and military ammunition by reallocating resources from Crimea, as well as military ammunition from less active regions, such as the Kherson sector. Ammunition from Crimea and Kherson to Kursk Oblast includes Soviet Zu-23 23 mm twin anti-aircraft guns, landing combat vehicles, military Kamaz cargo trucks, used to transport ammunition or personnel. Sharing all these critical details, partisans of the Atesh group said that they continue to monitor Russian military movements and share this information with the Ukrainian Defense Forces. In a recent report, Atesh agents discovered a Buk M3 medium-range anti-aircraft missile system on the coast of the Gagarin district in Sevastopol. Among the discoveries of the partisan members was also a P-18 radar station used for early warning and targeting for the Buk M3. The dispatch of these military resources from Crimea and Kherson to Kursk is quite at odds with Russia's idea of complete control over southern Ukraine and the Black Sea. Russian President Vladimir Putin's statements about protecting the Crimean Peninsula lose their impact in the face of all this. But can Vladimir Putin protect Crimea against Ukrainian aggression? Can Russia reassert its dominance in the Black Sea? Before exploring the answers to these questions, we can take a look back in history at similar situations Russia has faced. In 1905, Russia was shocked by a dramatic naval loss to Japan. Yet even in cases where it was not completely defeated, Russian naval power has historically been consistently constrained. In the First World War, Russia cooperated with the British Royal Navy to limit German trading activities in the Baltic Sea and Turkish commercial and military access in the Black Sea. In the Second World War, Russia relied on material support from the Allies and was largely blockaded in the Baltic Sea and Black Sea ports. Many ships were brought close to home or deprived of their weapons as artillery or offshore support for the territorial struggle with Germany. Meanwhile, during the Cold War, although the Soviet Union built fast-moving missile boats and some aircraft carriers, its reach into distant waters relied on submarines. The main purpose of the Soviet Mediterranean fleet was to prevent NATO from entering the Black Sea. And now Russia has lost control of the Black Sea. It cannot operate in these once secure near waters. This loss of control also reduces Russia's ability to project naval power from the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Let us now look at how Russia can solve this equation and what options Putin should focus on. Faced with a major loss in its backyard and weakened in its near waters, Russia can project its power in distant waters only through cooperation with China. China is also investing heavily in its naval capacity in distant waters. The joint naval exercises in the South China Sea in July 2024 are proof of this cooperation. Wang Guangzheng of the Southern Theater of the Chinese People's Liberation Army Navy said that joint Sino-Russian patrols can promote deepening and practical cooperation between the two sides in multiple directions and fields. For Russia, this cooperation is a mutually beneficial project of naval power projection that makes complete military sense, but it seems to be largely to China's advantage. To regain control of the Black Sea, Russia could help China defend its near northern waters and secure access to distant waters via the Arctic Ocean. In this way, China could help Russia regain its lost advantage in the Black Sea. Moscow's strategic interests will only be supported if they align with Chinese interests. More importantly, sea power is about power projection for economic gain. China is likely to use Russia to protect its continued economic access to the remote waters of Africa, the Pacific, Europe, and South America, but it is unlikely to jeopardize these interests for Russian objectives. Of course, Russia has offshore economic interests, especially in Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa. And securing Russian interests in Africa complements China's growing maritime presence in the Indian Ocean, securing its own and larger global economic interests. But cooperation is still likely to depend on China's will. So Russia's only way at the moment to project its naval power, bottled up in the waters close to the Black Sea as a result of its war in Ukraine, is access to the distant waters of Africa and the Indian Ocean as a junior partner with China, which will dictate the terms and conditions. Otherwise, even if Russia triumphs on land in its war against Ukraine, it will not compensate for its continued inability to project power on its own across the oceans. Thank you for tuning in.